for tuning into yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. The topic for today is going to be overnight service, overnight public transportation. And there we should distinguish, I want to say two models, but probably Berlin is a third one. So let's call the models the night bus and the same network but overnight. So I'm actually going to talk about the night bus first. So the issue with overnight is that it is manifold. The first is that urban rail generally needs predictable downtime for maintenance, which is everywhere in the world, with the exception of New York City, in the overnight periods. Now, you can still run overnight trains on single track. The issue is that the required... No, overnight is not the model. When I say overnight, I specifically don't mean transit runs 24/7. This is a very rare model. It exists in New York with a lot of compromises for weekend service, and in Copenhagen, where this is special to their twin bore driverless trains, where you can do work in one tube without disturbing the other tube. So what you do there is you So the issues for overnight, first of all, you need the maintenance intervals. Second, demand is very low, and this means that you need to design your network around the expectation of low frequency. Which means that, for example, untimed transfers lose value, and this is going to matter for night bus network design. Yes, LA does need more metro rail mileage than the New York City subway. I might mention, I'm tempted to say that I'm going to crown LA on Saturday, but no promises. So the issue with night bus is you're not facing capacity constraints. You need the maintenance intervals. You are facing frequency constraints in the sense that frequency is low enough that you need to think about things like transfer timing, about reducing transfers, about consolidating services to fewer, more frequent trunks. And again, so a driverless metro network could run overnight. The idea is, again, you do work on one track and then you maneuver around it. Frequency is generally low enough that you can do it if the crossovers are at the right spot, and if you can work on one track when there is service, when there's train in service next to it. Copenhagen was built with Bore Tunnel, so they have it as a freebie. Old cotton cover systems like New York, Paris, Berlin don't have that. I think in Berlin, actually, the track centers in Berlin look wide enough for me that it might be viable, actually. In New York, it's not unless they do more work, and they do need to do that more work, but they haven't done it. Things like having barriers between having. So the way that the New York City subway works, and I'm going to actually try to look for, let's do nycsubway.org and see what we can fish out of the photos. The thing in New York is that the track, you can walk, I mean, if you're a track walker, obviously you're not going to do it if you're a passenger, but you can walk between tracks. Home, navigate. I just want photos. Cars, lines, maps, history, behind the scenes. I just want images. More images, and yeah. So for example, okay, that's a yard. you're not going to randomly let me. Okay. So again, so this is obvious. So again, above ground, obviously it can walk between. But the thing is that underground, the way it works is that there are steel girders. So it's like steel. It would be, and so the train's not going to randomly derail from one track to another, but the workers can walk between very easily, and this also means that there isn't a lot of safety if workers are sitting on one track and there's a train on the adjacent track, which means that what they're doing is first of all slow the train near the work zone, and it's called flagging, and the flagging rules by which this might be good enough. Yeah, so these are thicker metal girders. They actually look like concrete to me. Yeah, these are thicker columns than the usual. Usually the columns are maybe every other. I think on the typical older lines, maybe every other column here would be missing. And so the thing is, you have, let's say, workers sitting here. So the rule is that when the train is next to them, it's slow down. But even when it's within a certain distance, it's slowing down just as a safety margin, and the safety margins keep tightening. Essentially because maintenance of way says we need it for safety and nobody pushes back. This leads to degradation of weekend service because this is not done just overnight. This is also done on weekends because they don't have full closures overnight. They have partial closures, and so the partial closures stretch into the weekends. And importantly, the work stops when the train passes. So if there's a train, if it's on a trunk line with several lines interlined, and the frequency on weekends is a train every 5 or 6 minutes, that means that they have 4 minutes of uninterrupted work time, and then for a minute a train passes, and then 4 minutes. So it's very low maintenance productivity. But again, that's a New York specific thing. No, you should not file. It's not dum-dum. It's and yes, I know what you did. It's not dum-dum. It's something that is resolvable but requires a lot of work. So, for example, Borners, in London, most of the lines are not like this. Most of the lines are in twin bores, and then the question is just where the galleries are spaced. So Copenhagen was built. So if it's cut and cover, you can essentially build new crossovers. Not quite for free because they do need to mod the columns a little bit, but you can do it. And it's something that's much harder if you're bored and you didn't pre-plan on this. Copenhagen did pre-plan on building the crossovers and blasting crossovers at the required intervals. I do not know if London did. I genuinely do not know. If London can do it, great. You can do it. I'm sure. The Copenhagen system was built so recently that a lot of international English-speaking consultants would have been involved, which means that Copenhagen is very legible to TfL. So it's something that London could do if the crossovers were at the correct intervals. I do not know if they are. If they're not, sucks for you. Yeah, you can do 24/3. But I'm talking about 24/7, not 24/3. Hell, London is partially 24/3. London took a couple of the lines that serve the West End rather than the city, like I'm forgetting which ones. I think the Vic, the Charing Cross half of the Northern, maybe the Central. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they probably thought of the options. Again, it's entirely possible that it's just not possible. I don't know. But anyway, so the flip side is overnight, as I mentioned, you do need to think about maintenance. So often you just so you can't ever run normal service. The second thing is you're not going to have a lot of frequency because demand is very low, so you need to think about how to consolidate. This, of course, favors a more subway-centric solution because the subway is based on fewer, stronger lines. But you don't need the capacity, so you don't need a long train. You can do short. And the last thing is there's no traffic, which means that if you have a street network, which means if you're not London, then so if you're not London, you can use the streets usually, and I should not do Itzek around here. So what do I mean by use the streets? And this is something where Berlin, for example, is an especially good example of this. Berlin has, so in Berlin, all of the U-Bahn lines run under streets. And this includes the more recent board stuff. U5 is bored beneath Unter den Linden. I mean, there are deviations, which of course are smoother when they're done in tunnel than when they would be done by a night bus or night tram, but that's not that big a deal. And so you can use the streets, and that is fine, usually. Now, in some cities, you cannot use the streets. And London and New York are two prominent examples. So in London, this is how the streets of London look. So yes, London technically has streets. It has main streets, and by main streets, I mean streets that are narrower than the not especially main streets of like residential neighborhoods of Berlin. This is a main street. I think a subway line runs on it. Yeah, a cotton. I believe cotton cover. Right. This is not the central. Right. This is the district. Island Road. Yeah. Yeah. So in London, this passes for a main street. Does this look? I guess they have some housing projects with setbacks here, but not counting the setbacks, this is okay. This is maybe a Manhattan Avenue, maybe, and like there aren't a lot of streets like this in London. So yeah, here. So if you want to do a dedicated night network, yeah, you would put a bus here. But where else? Where the hell else would you put a bus? This is actually why London invented deep boring for urban rail service. The first line, the Met, went cut and cover beneath Euston Road. The problem is Euston Road is literally the only thing in this direction that's wide enough for such a line. So the second line, the district, essentially carved new right-of-way through the most expensive parts of London and cost, in today's money, I believe $100 or $110 million a kilometer. This was the 1860s. At the time, it was a lot of money. It took until the IND in 1930s New York to exceed that. I believe the Victoria line was maybe only a little bit more expensive per kilometer than the district. Let's compare the ability of Britain to afford anything in the 1960s versus the 1860s. I mean, people joke about British decline or something, but because it could no longer randomly starve tens of millions of Indians to death. But objectively speaking, Britain was immeasurably wealthier in the 1960s and in the 1860s. The cost per kilometer in inflation-adjusted pounds was slightly higher on the Vic. Slightly. I believe something like 130 versus 110. 2022 PPP dollars. So, yeah, London ran out of streets and needed the deep bore. And if you're deep boring, I mean, sometimes you're following streets, but I mean, again, it's London. What streets? Now, New York is not London. London is famously called a labyrinth. New York is famously a grid, right? The streets and the avenues are numbered. I learned immediately when moving to New York in 2006 which avenue goes which direction, and have retained the information in the subsequent 17 years. Yeah, London has shit car flow, but I mean, Berlin has nice car flow, and I think Berlin's model split is about the same as London's, but when I say Berlin, I mean Berlin plus Umland, and when I say London, I mean London plus the plus surrounding Toryland. So the issue is not that Queens makes no sense. Queens is gridded. The streets are wide. The part that makes no sense is that the numbers were cobbled from separate sources. So the streets in the neighborhood that I keep staying in when I go visit I believe they go 12th Street, 13th Street, 21st Street. So other than the fact that the numbers are kind of drunk, it's actually a pretty intact grid. The problem is rivers exist. Now, I believe the Thames is maybe 100, 120 meters wide, if that. I think the Seine is, I remember, sub 100. The Spree, I think, is narrower than that. The East River is something like a kilometer. Okay, a little bit less. Sorry, here from 735 meters. Yeah. This was recognized at the very beginning of the 19th century already in the Commissioner's Plan, which created the Manhattan's grid, which pointed out the Manhattan's grid. You don't have double determiners. The Manhattan grid. The Commissioner's Plan pointed out that pointed out the comparison of New York to London and Paris, and it pointed out right there in that report from I think 1811 that London and Paris were on much narrower rivers than the East and Hudson, and therefore could much more easily grow on both sides of the river in all directions, whereas New York, starting in its core in Lower Manhattan, had to go just straight north. And this is why they created the grid the way they did. And to this day, you can notice that there aren't that many water crossings. Now, the Harlem River is different. The Harlem River is much narrower. It's much more like the Thames or the Seine. Basically, every avenue runs through, basically. And that gets to the point that the bus grid in the Bronx actually bleeds through Upper Manhattan very naturally. A lot of the east-west routes then very easily turn into crosstowns in Manhattan, into 140, into one of the routes on 125th turns to a Bronx route, then 145th, 155th, 207 with Fordham. So that's something that's not actually hard because the Harlem River is narrow. But the East River has, from Manhattan to Queens and Brooklyn, 5 crossings by, no, 6, I guess 7 crossings by road, but 2 are tunnels. So Triborough, Midtown, Triborough, Queensboro, Queens Midtown Tunnel, Williamsburg, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and then the Battery Tunnel. There are more crossings by subway than by road. And this means that doing a night bus parallel to that is really difficult. So there are people who are trying to do night buses. There are people who, on the London model, are trying to propose night buses for New York. They're kind of dumb about this. Not Ireland anymore. I mean, I guess nowadays the polls in Britain are such that nowhere in Britain is Toryland, but at equilibrium, when... Yeah, so this depends on whether Keith can keep his lead in the polls. I think the median is Labour plus 15, so sure. We'll see. So anyway, the point is that New York is pretty special in lacking streets that go across the rivers, and this does force overnight subway. Like, you can't just shut the subway overnight. It's fine, you don't need to. I mean, New York has 4-track lines, which makes everything a lot easier. They just have unproductive maintenance. So bear in mind, when I talk about overnight subway service, this is not what I mean by night transit networks. When I mean the model of night transit networks, I mean essentially 2 models, and again, Berlin is kind of a weird third one. So there's the model where you have completely separate services for overnight. And Vancouver is actually a really good example of this. So as I mentioned, important features of overnight are just... Okay, so there's the maintenance issue, but that just says, okay, you need to probably do it by bus and not by subway. And having made the decision to do it by bus, you're still not going to fill buses at very high frequency. What does this mean? It means that you need to think in very different terms from the daytime network. So the Vancouver daytime network is that, first of all, there's SkyTrain radiating from the center of Vancouver. And then there are buses. The buses in Vancouver are very strong, and they form a grid using the, as you can kind of see here already, grid of arterial roads. I keep mocking London for having very narrow streets that can't really host buses. Just to put things in perspective, this is where I lived in Vancouver. I lived at Vine and First. I believe this is 4th, so 3rd, 2nd, 1st. Vine, I think, is 3 from Burrard, not 2 from Burrard. No, Vine is 3 from Arbutus. So Arbutus, yeah, this is where I lived. So already we're seeing things like not very big buildings. I mean, this is big, but where I lived was not. You can't actually tell how wide the street is because of setbacks. So I guess technically you can say it's a 15-meter street, but it's kind of deceptive because of all the setbacks. And this was the main commercial drag. 4th, this was the supermarket surrounded by parking. This was also where the bus stop was, where I would take the bus to UBC. I believe it's 30 meters. Or maybe it's actually less. Okay, yeah, it's just, maybe it's less because they don't believe in sidewalks on the west side, yeah. Maybe it's 24 or something, but again, they don't believe in sidewalks, so there actually are a lot of lanes. These are mostly pretty small buildings, so the buses, and there isn't a lot of traffic, is important. There's so many east-west streets, including east-west arterials, that the traffic here flows pretty fast. And there's also, I don't want to say signal priority, because people might imagine I mean transit signal priority, and there absolutely isn't that. But there's signal priority for through traffic on these east-west roads over cross traffic, except on the few arterials that go north-south, like McDonald or Alma. So the upshot is that the buses are really fast, even daytime. But also, there are a bunch of these buses, east-west, north-south. They connect, of course, to SkyTrain. No, there's no SkyTrain on the west side yet, but the buses just form a grid with a few grid interruptions, like Kingsway. So it's not the strongest bus, but it's one of the stronger buses, despite paralleling SkyTrain, kind of. There's a bit of grid interruption. There are a bunch of routes that, instead of kind of continuing east as you might expect, divert to downtown Vancouver. And the buses all run, I believe, at worst every 8 minutes daytime, which is the limit of an untimed transfer. some of the stronger corridors, like my own 4th Avenue, even had local and rapids. The rapids off peak ran every 12 minutes. Peak they ran so frequently there weren't really schedules. And so people do make untimed transfers when it's a bus every 8 minutes. Or sometimes every less than that. Broadway, I think the local and the rapid each run every like 4 or 5 minutes, I think. And this does not work when you're doing night bus frequency. Will they get a subway connection to Staten Island? Not if the present people at the MTA and the government of New York are in charge. They can't build. Yeah, anything that's on a medieval core type of a street is probably good enough for a bus, but like London, I shouldn't say medieval because, for example, London has narrow streets even well past the medieval core. Yeah, that's... Wait, why do you need to learn a timetable? U5, where you live, is every 5 minutes. It's only every 10 minutes, I think, east of where you live, I think. I mean, bear in mind, contemporary Paris. Oh, S5, yeah, no, oh, yeah, if you're on the S-Bahn, then I'm sorry. It's not just Georgian, like Paris at the time also had very narrow streets. It just very famously, or infamously, Osman rebuilt it with wider arterials. Yeah, sure, but remember, New York can't build. We're trying to help it build, but you can lead a horse through the water, but you can't make it drink. But anyway, so the point is that Vancouver has a daytime untimed grid. This is a really good grid, and I say this is someone who commuted by bus 2 years. Compare that with the fact that since leaving Vancouver, I left Vancouver in 2014, I've been a Euro for almost 9 years, 2 in Stockholm, 2 and a bit in Paris, like almost 2.5, and a little over 4 in Berlin. And in these almost 9 years, in the cities that I lived in, the number of times that I have I've seen the inside of a bus, in Stockholm and in Paris, it's easy. The number is 0. In Berlin, I do not remember the number, but it is single digits. 4 of them were incurred for airport travel, which is not going to happen anymore because the new airport finally opened with a rail connection. I think maybe 2 or 3 times when I was traveling with someone else who preferred to take a bus over walking 1.5 kilometers in the rain. In Vancouver, I rode the bus and it was fine with an untimed grid. It worked really well, and it wasn't just home to work where it was a one-state ride. It was also random gaming events where I sometimes need to do a lot of transferring. Night buses in Vancouver do not work this way because the night bus comes every half hour. You do not make untimed transfers every half hour unless you are destitute. Now, an American city the size of Vancouver generally only runs buses for the benefits of the destitute. However, Canada is not entirely like the United States. The model split in Vancouver on the eve of the opening of the Evergreen extension was 20%. I imagine that on the eve of Corona, it would have been maybe 22-ish%. And soon the half of the Broadway subway is going to open. So when it builds all the way to UBC, Vancouver might actually be starting at 30. Now, to put this in perspective, in the United States, Metro New York is at 30. Metro San Francisco, if you pretend that Silicon Valley is not part of that metro area, is 17. And if you don't pretend, we're talking more like 12. So the buses, again, are actually used as an untimed grid every 8 minutes, not every 30. So every 30, you need to time the transfers, which means you can't run the buses as a grid, which means that you pick a location, a central location, In Vancouver, it's right. I want to say it's Georgia and something. So it's not quite waterfront terminal, but it's near waterfront terminal, like somewhere around here. I don't remember. Um, and you have all the buses converged there, uh, and then you go in all directions. So, for example, instead of having a continuous bus go on Broadway, there's a West Broadway bus. Like, I don't remember the route, maybe like this, and then an East Broadway bus, which I'm forgetting whether it diverts here to go through Van City Hall or like this or something like that, or maybe even I imagine it would serve Van City Hall, so it would go would go via Canby, via Canby Bridge, not Granville Bridge, and then you go like this, and likewise along the other routes, Fourth. I imagine there are things that even duplicate SkyTrain. So another important feature of night buses, the daytime buses work with the subway. Overnight, there's no subway. Now, sometimes this isn't too relevant because Kingsway is a strong bus corridor with or without SkyTrain. That said, at least when I last looked, which would have been maybe 6 years ago, Kingsway was weird in that it was such a popular night bus corridor that they ran it every 20 minutes, breaking the time transfers with everything else. That's probably something they should not be doing, and I hope they fix it to every 15, I guess, so every other bus is timed with the rest of the network. Or if they can at all get away with it, maybe Arctics every 20 minutes? Every 30? Not every 20. Or even run everything every 20 if there's enough demand. However, I want to say, demand on Lougheed Highway is much weaker. So the Broadway Limited, not the Broadway Limited, the American train. I mean the limited buses that run on Broadway and makes it the busiest bus corridor in North America. The limited only goes as far as the SkyTrain connection at Commercial here, and the locals keep going east. I think up to maybe the boundary road. Maybe they connect a little. Maybe they go a little bit to hit to hit some Millennium Line section. I'm not sure, but the point is that overnight you would need to also cover Lougheed Highway, which normally doesn't need a bus because there's SkyTrain above it. Likewise, Canby used to be the strongest, maybe north-south. I think it was the strongest north-south bus corridor until SkyTrain was built, and then the corridor just was reduced to a very weak one, just because there's SkyTrain underneath. It's much faster, and it even has an impact to a one-block radius. No, not now. For some reason, not east. I'm not sure why, but so east of Canby, the roads go Main, Fraser, Knight, and Commercial/Victoria. Commercial/Victoria is the 20, which is the strong. I believe it's the busiest bus route other than Broadway, which is 99 or 9. I think as a corridor, it's maybe number 3 or 4 because there's a bunch of buses on Hastings and a bunch of buses on 4th. I believe at the corridor level, it goes Broadway, then Hastings, then 4th, maybe then Commercial, but still very busy corridor. And Main and Fraser are both top 10, the 3 and the 8. And the fact that having not lived in Vancouver 9 years or visited since then, and I still remember the bus numbers on routes that I rode maybe twice in those 2 years that I lived there. That's just a testament to how strong the bus grid is, that I can just memorize a list of numbers, and retain that information. But west of Broadway, at any rate, not Broadway, west of Canby, Oak, I think it's 17 and 15, and both of these are trash buses. Like very little ridership. The ridership only picks up on Arbutus. This is 16. And then McDonald, where I think I forget the number on McDonald because I think no, maybe McDonald is 22. 222 are McDonald, and then Alma is 7 maybe. And so anyway, instead of a grid, you need to time the transfers. They do it here. You also need to provide buses that are parallel to the subway, which during the daytime you would not need to do because the subway exists, or maybe you would do, but it would be trash buses that are not very frequent and are just there for the 158-year-old who should be retired already, who is used to riding the bus and will not walk 300 meters longer to better service, even though they're perfectly able-bodied. Again, 58-year-olds who are not able-bodied are probably no longer in the workforce. There's a reason there's the expression prime age labor force participation, which is I think 25 to 54. Yeah, Rome. Yeah, that's not even medieval. I avoid buses in German style integrated transit because because the buses are really rattly and the service is not very good, and you don't ever need to see a bus inside the ring. Outside the ring sometimes, but honestly, I would walk the 1.5 kilometers from Märkisches Viertel to Wittenau, for example, when doing some Urbachs. I've never actually seen a time transfer to a bus in Berlin. And the reason is that the U-Bahn is so frequent that they don't actually do that. I imagine really far out where it's an S-Bahn every 20 minutes they do that. But even the every 10 minutes tales, I haven't seen that. Or the one time I flew out of Schönefeld, the bus from Rudo, I don't think it was timed. Likewise, the buses from the buses to Tegel, they were not timed. Yeah, sure. But anyway, so in so the night bus network, I don't remember which buses are available, but I imagine it should have a bus running down Cambie, which means that the night bus network will not necessarily look like the daytime bus network. And I don't just mean that it's not a grid, I mean that sometimes the routes are different. Again, because you do need to deal with the fact that some corridors are really strong and just don't exist as strong buses because rail exists. Now, as I said, there are two models for doing this, and Vancouver is the purest North American example I know of the night bus model. I think Paris is a European example. At least at suburban scale, there's I want to say 12 radii or 6 diameters that all converge on Les Halles. I forget how frequent. Then there's the other model, which I'm going to call the New York model, and I don't even mean New York model in the sense of the in the sense that the subway runs overnight, because the model can exist even where it doesn't. And that model is you just run the same network except less frequent. So in New York, there's no such thing as a night bus network. There are things that you might want to do if you were trying to do night buses in New York. I imagine things like time some of the transfers. The problem with timing the transfers is that the kind of hubs in New York where you would expect time transfers are places like Flushing and Jamaica, and these are, let's face it, not actually that important for bus ridership because the transit taking behavior in Eastern Queens is extremely peaky. Yeah, you can keep doing this as for the service workers, and that's going to be helpful, but the big prizes are things like, I don't know, LaGuardia to Bushwick, or Harlem to the South Bronx, or the Village to wherever. And so, and not, let's say, things to Whitestone or any place where people would take a rush hour bus to Jamaica or Flushing to connect to an express subway to Manhattan. So that's the first problem: is it kind of where would you do a time transfer in New York? But what you could do, so what New York does do, and what you could do, is they run. So some buses just don't run overnight, or they run at pitiful frequencies, like every hour. But I don't just mean these. I mean the ones that actually maintain something like a 20-minute headway even overnight, where untimed transfers are still bad, but a person who does not own a car because the subway is good enough for all of their daytime needs, but from time to time has to take an overnight trip, will, probably reluctantly, but will do untimed transfers every 20 or every 15 minutes. So it's bad, don't get me wrong, but it's not the end of the world. Bear in mind, I'm saying it's not the end of the world. When I had to rely on these buses going Columbia to Upper East Side, what I did was I took the one and I walked across Central Park. I think after 1 o'clock or something, or the buses that I needed stopped running at the useful frequency. So I would just walk the 3 kilometers, and or 2.5. Okay, now I'm nerd snapping myself into measuring the distance. So 72nd and Broadway. 72nd is continuous, not for a car, but on foot through the park. And they lived at York. 2.7, yeah. And if you're wondering if New York City is safe enough to walk like this at 3 or 4 in the morning, the answer is yes, it is. Stop reading the New York Post. Or stop listening to boomers who read the New York Post 40 years ago and then white fled the city and haven't come back after dark. But I mean, yeah, there was an option. It was like 1 to the 7 because the shuttle doesn't run overnight, to the 6 back here, but not good enough frequency. So again, doable, viable, but only marginally so. And but there are honestly there are bus routes that are strong enough they could probably do every 15 minutes. Where untimed transfers are still bad, but they start looking vaguely like something a person who is like not on welfare would do. I don't know. I don't mind walking. But anyway, so things like, I don't know, Utica, Nostrand, these are probably not buses that you want to do in a they probably don't want to do as part of kind of a time transfer overnight. You just run them, I guess, every 15 minutes or something, or every 20 overnight, and so then that's kind of the other model. Essentially, you take the network and just thin it out. You drop the buses that are just not really useful, like the 72nd Street crosstown. As I mentioned, 72nd is continuous through the park for pedestrians, but not for cars. You can kind of see that the Parkway drives, the sunken ones, for some reason, I don't actually know why, but 72nd does not have that, and 66th does. 66th/65th. So 72nd, so the M72, instead of going like this, as it should, because a lot of, rich people who recreationally use the park don't like it when smelly buses go on their, I want to say sully their park or something, but the ridership profile of people on the M72 is pretty high income. So it's just people who think that buses are some conspiracy to get cars back here or some shit. Because neighborhood activists, in addition to being to tilting snob in many ways, they also tilt boomer, with a lot of social memory of things that are no longer relevant. In this case, Robert Moses. So instead the bus goes like this. So the bus goes on 72nd, then goes down 5th or up Madison through 66/65th, and then back up Central Park. So because of this is the least busy of the crosstowns in Uptown. Actually, no, I won't say it's the least busy, but M116 has the same problem and is also very weak. And then the M66 is stronger, M79 is stronger, M96 is stronger, and the M86 is very strong. So because of that, this doesn't really run overnight, and that's fine. You do want to run fewer routes because of the frequency issue. And so these are essentially the two models. Now, Berlin is kind of a weird one in which the model here is different, and I don't mean that the U-Bahn runs overnight on weekends. I mean weekday nights. It's not an amazing trade, but I mean, like the buses really are not good to ride. Like the ride quality on the bus is not good. So anyway, in Berlin, the model is that the night buses duplicate the U-Bahn with untimed transfers, but they're frequent. I think it's every 15 minutes, which is atypically frequent for a night bus. Usually it's every 20 or 30, or if you hate yourself, every hour. And you shouldn't say yourself, the sort of people planning these networks will use them. If you hate the riders, you can do it every hour. If you hate the riders even more, you can do something irregular. So in Berlin, I think it's every 15 minutes, and I think also maybe the trams run overnight. And the night buses are just N followed by a number, and that's just the line that they duplicate. So there's N8, which is just a duplication of U8, N1 and 5 and so on. And again, this works because Berlin has streets for this. Berlin is not the weird one. I mean, the norm in a European or a North American city is that the streets are almost entirely wide enough for this. Usually when they're not, it's some kind of very old medieval core. Again, London is the weird one where it's not. Stockholm, for example, has an old medieval core where you don't really have motorable street, where the streets aren't really motorable, but usually the thing is, if the streets are genuinely not motorable, it means that commerce will have skipped that area except for stuff serving tourists. Gamla Stan is a tourist ghetto. How much of a tourist ghetto is it? There are English language bookstores there. Like there's the English language bookstore on this road that I would really like because they have SFF books. So where did I get my books of The Expanse when I lived in Stockholm? Where did I get RPG source books? Here, I don't remember at the SFF books, at the English SFF bookstore. So that's on. This is so a tourist ghetto. It has money changing storefronts, which, just to make it very clear, there are cities where it's very normal, or it used to be maybe very normal, to have money changing storefronts, not for tourists, like Tel Aviv and Singapore. Residential neighborhoods in Tel Aviv and Singapore had these because people were people in Israel fly a lot, and then they need to change the currency. So the storefronts are mostly targeting locals. And they also have, because there are a lot of them and they're targeting locals and not stiffing tourists, they offer really attractive rates. How attractive? The vigorish, like the gap between sale price and the sell and buy price in both Tel Aviv and Singapore is lower. Like I'm paying less vigorish changing money at such a storefront money changer in Tel Aviv or Singapore than I do when I move money thousands to tens of thousands at a time from my American to my European bank account. And in some extreme cases, I don't get a better deal, but I probably get a similar deal if I take a bundle of dollars, change them to shekels and then change shekels to euros or dollars to Sing dollars and then Sing dollars to euros, like paying the vigorish twice at such a storefront than getting it at a bank. That's how good the rates are. This is not at all Stockholm. Stockholmers, I guess, use cards. Stockholm, even in 2014 to 2016, was almost a cash-free society even then. The upshot is that Swedes didn't really use money changers. That money changers were entirely in tourist ghettos, and they offered shit rates. So this is what happens when you try to do like a pedestrian zone that's not for the locals. It's just going to be a tourist ghetto. And then if you want to see what like large numbers of people who actually chose not to rely on the car do, they don't live here. They live here. They actually probably all of them live here. Here, things like that. But in Stockholm, again, outside the tourist ghetto, these are the streets of Stockholm. Yeah, you can night bus this. That's fine. That's the norm. In North America, of course, the norm is to be more rigidly gridded. Do most medieval cores even have surface transit? No, not in Stockholm. In Stockholm, so Gamla Stan has a subway stop, but it's right here. It also has a freeway running through the western margin. So the western margin is where the transit goes. Maybe there's a bit here, I don't know. Again, I lived in Stockholm 2 years without ever seeing the inside of a bus because I didn't need to. Yeah, Gamla Stan is a lot smaller than is a lot smaller than, let's say. Actually, I don't know if it's much smaller than the Altstadt of Wien, right? Because what is this? I actually don't know Vienna well enough to have a good clue. So I mean the stuff that's surrounded by the actually motorable streets. I mean, technically these are also motorable. It's just they're motorable for people. For deliveries, they're not motorable. So let's even do this. This is 0.23. Okay. And what is the Altstadt? The former sworn enemy of Sweden. So do I cut it here or here? There's do you cut it where the de facto ring goes, or I guess here is maybe more appropriate. And yes, I'm aware that the oldest parts are actually here and not. I mean, bear in mind, even here, evidently, transit does penetrate. And yeah, we can mock Austria for being so corrupt that if it were Italy, people say, "Oh yeah, Southern Europe is like this." Yeah. Okay, so the Innenstadt is a lot bigger, and even if you do something smaller, it's going to be substantially larger than Gamla Stan. The Vienna core has a lot of this, but I mean, the Vienna core, this is a very motorable street. Look at it. And even some of the inner this is so I mean if you're talking about about an actual city center type core, again, Gamla Stan is for the tourists. If we're thinking about the actual core of Stockholm, you need to include all of Södermalm, and of course all of the actual city center, which is the inner parts of Norrmalm and Östermalm. There's this division between Norrmalm and Östermalm. The division is Södermalm, Norrmalm, Östermalm, and Kungsholmen. And the division between... So Kungsholmen is just a separate island. Södermalm is a separate island. And Södermalm has a very strong separate identity. It's a little bit like left bank versus right bank in Paris. with kind of the same usual with not the same banks but the same north-south orientation as in Stockholm, where the city core spilled north, and then in the south, it's populated by bourgeois people who pretended they're not bourgeois. But the Norrmalm-Östermalm boundary is very fuzzy, and I don't think there are genuine separate identities for that. And the question of whether you count Vasastan as a separate neighborhood. Anyway, this is the central business district of Stockholm. It's from just north. So I think government offices would be more like here, and then commercial stuff would be a bit farther north, like private commercial stuff. So the Stockholm city core, and it includes the high density residential core, has to go at least as far as the historic walls, which would have been something like here, like the historic tax walls. I don't mean and then you have the liminal shit like SU, which is just a campus. I believe so. Whether this counts as central Stockholm is kind of debatable because it's not contiguous with central Stockholm. But I believe that the congestion pricing gate is here. So the congestion pricing limit is this. I think it includes Djurgården, but very few people actually live here, so it doesn't matter very much. I don't think it includes Kvarnholmen, but it does include all of Södermalm, all of Kungsholmen, and here it's just the municipal boundary, which is atypically inner here, and then everywhere else it's not. That would be the. Yeah, no, you can pedestrianize a wide road, and that's fine. You can make sections of the city car free, but usually if it's just a narrow medieval core that hasn't been updated, because there's literally no such thing in the Western world as a city that never went through any historic phase in which the city was governed by very pro-car people who didn't just want but actually did make the historic city car friendlier. It means that if you have an area that's clearly never been car friendly, it means that it's just not important. Whereas you can absolutely have things that very clearly had urban renewal because pro-car people who were in charge in, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, made them so, and then Greens who were in charge subsequently, or New Left or whatever, made them pedestrianized. But if you have something that looks like it's never been retouched, like Gamla Stan, it's because it was just not perceived as important enough. Is an important distinction. And I'm saying Western world because Tokyo is different. Tokyo genuinely skipped that phase to a large extent. I can't actually think of any highway removals in Tokyo. Even Seoul has that. Has the one that what's his name? Lee Myung-bak was part of, the expressway through the river. But I don't think Tokyo ever went through that phase. So in Tokyo, you can actually have intact, and there would be local drags, but it would still be modern streets that are 10 meters wide. And I don't mean 10 meters roadway, I mean 10 meters building to building. And this is also related to the fact that buses in Japan are trash. If you don't live walking distance to the train, my understanding is that you bike there, or you just drive. You don't, there are connecting buses in Japan, they're just not nearly as important. I believe, the figure that's, I'm not going to find the reference anymore, but the figure that's stuck in my head is that Toei runs something like half as much, gets maybe half as much bus ridership in Tokyo as New York City Transit gets in New York. And to put this in perspective, Tokyo has something like 50% higher subway ridership than New York. But anyway, but that's not NatBus. NatBus models is, again, generally the streets will be motorable. if it's based on a modern understanding of a transit first city, then it doesn't matter if there's pedestrianization, because the pedestrianization will always work to include buses. And if it doesn't, as in the case of 72nd through Central Park, it's going to be either a case of pretty unique NIMBYism, or quite frankly, a bus that was never important enough to figure into the plans. So for example, in Paris, there's extensive pedestrianization, and it's okay because, first of all, you don't ever need to ride a bus in Paris, in the city proper at least. The metro goes everywhere. But even if you did, the buses can stay on the wide roads. The wide roads are never getting pedestrianized. They're just getting road dieted, which means the buses get to stay. And often, the road diet, what it means is the buses get dedicated lanes, so the buses get stronger rather than weaker. I slag on Anne Hidalgo all the time for not building enough housing, but she actually does do transit first for the people fortunate enough to have enough money to live in her city, which is not gonna make available to the rest of France. For people who can actually afford this shit, the city is getting transit friendlier. This is not. I mean, the problem is the exclusion. So, for example, this used to be way more driving lanes when I lived there, and the driving lanes were being narrowed down. First replaced with bollards. Now, since then, these became parklets. As I was living there, this happened very recently, and again, it's good. And none of this is going to hurt any kind of night bus network. Why not? Well, remember, one of the rules of the night bus system is there isn't actually a lot of traffic. We can debate whether there's demand destruction, or if it's going to generate more traffic to replace what used to be, I believe, 6 lanes of traffic and turn that into 4 narrower lanes at Nation. But certainly overnight, 4 lanes of traffic are more than enough. So it's not going to hurt the night bus network. So again, this is again modern pedestrianization. This is a place that was made more modernist in the case of Paris even before the car, because it was about creating grander streets for like empire building purposes, essentially for prestige, for reasons of prestige. Again, there were some genuine sanitation problems in Paris. The streets had open sewage, but in addition, they also made sure to do things like kick out the working class, create grand boulevards that would make Napoleon III feel important, suppress popular rebellions, which of course they didn't. Napoleon III did get overthrown. And I mean, yeah, the Paris Commune was defeated, but the purpose of Napoleon III was not to create a situation in which the alternative to him was a bourgeois democracy rather than a socialist revolution. For the purpose of Napoleon III, any regime in which he's not in charge is equally bad. If anything, certainly maybe not for Napoleon III, but for a more modern dictator, quite to the contrary, they want to the regime that they want to forestall the most is bourgeois democracy, right? Because a bourgeois democracy is something that could get other people's support, right? I mean, if so if you're, I don't know, the United States, and you know that protesters in a hostile conservative dictatorship, let's call it Iran or something, if you know that these people are proposing some kind of bourgeois liberal democracy, you're going to be more in support of them, right? I mean, if it's people who are like motivated by things like international human rights, who talk a lot about civil liberties, they talk a lot about anti-corruption, and yeah, they're probably going to do more social spending, but social spending that's going to make their country not even Sweden, let alone the Soviet Union, then the US might want that because it would be very happy to use its heft and soft power to say, "Ooh, we love you. Just sign this to make sure that like you don't threaten Israel or something. But we would love to support you." And then if you have people and if you have regime opponents who are proposing something like the Paris Commune that threatens, that threatens the United States, that threatens American allies, it threatens international capital and so on. So they would be more scared. And so actually modern dictators often, on most political matters, they try to rearrange things so that the opposition to them is channeled to things that are more scary, that look scarier to, again, the United States, NATO, EU, international capital. So it would be either, in this case, not socialist, but probably Islamist. You see it a lot in the Arab world where secular dictators try to arrange things that the only opposition to them comes from people on the Islamist to jihadist spectrum and not from the sort of people who would worship on the altar of the Third Republic. But even then, they're still building these modernist cities for forestalling protests, for again, a lot of prestige building. This is pedestrian streets often don't have buses, but the point is, often the buses, but often they're designed so that the buses can serve them. So actually, I'm not going to give you a European example, and again, I say this as someone who very rarely rides a European bus, but I can give you a good North American example in the city that, in addition to being in many ways the YIMBY capital of North America, there's an argument to be made that for Seattle over Vancouver, but I think Vancouver over Seattle is probably correct. Also, somehow the city that still can't build, but is the closest to can build in North America at this point, I think their construction costs are only about $400 million US per kilometer, or $500 million US per kilometer, which at this point is low by North American standards, unfortunately. I think Toronto was careening past $1 billion. So in Vancouver, my point is, I'm justifying this because I'm trying to explain that Vancouver to me is persuasive authority. That's Granville. So Granville, so this is, so for the purposes of this discussion, these streets, the ones that go northeast to southwest, go north-south. Reason being, they turn into north-south roads outside downtown. And the ones that go northwest to southeast are going to be called east-west streets because they underlie a lot of east-west streets east of downtown. So anyway, Granville is the main north-south street through downtown Vancouver. And you might be able to tell it's also where the Canada Line tunnel. So this is the only recent tunnel built because the Expo Line uses a legacy freight rail tunnel that was rebuilt to permit passenger rail service. And so Granville, so the rule of Granville is that I believe it goes pedestrian only, I want to say weekends and evenings. And then the rule is that the buses, and these are not even diesel buses, these are trolleys, so there's infrastructure related. Instead of going up and down Granville, they go on parallel streets. So to the west it's Howe, and to the east I don't remember anymore. I'm gonna look. To the east it is Seymour. And this is a regular rule. So when you pedestrianize a street that's an important surface transit street, which Granville still is, because the trolleys. So I slagged before on Granville as a bus on the west side. Partly, I won't say it's partly its relative proximity to Canby, but that's maybe Victor of Oak. More importantly, look what Granville is next to here. So yeah, Canby. This is Van City Center. Yeah, it's big. And there's actually pretty strong stuff here. Like there's Langara College and so on. Here, there's Chauncey. Chauncey is the neighborhood of people who are so toffy that the other toffs hate them. The NIMBY, one of the NIMBYs here, spoke to the media, complaining about, I don't even remember what, and what they said, and this is a NIMBY justifying their own privilege, saying, we are the creme de la creme. This is someone who, and of course a line of that would have been printed, because how can you not print that? People here genuinely are that out of touch that they say this about themselves unironically. This is Chauncey. The other NIMBYs in Vancouver, the ones who think that all of the housing problems are the fault of Asian immigrants, when I say, oh yeah, let's just upzone Chauncey, they like upzoning Chauncey because they hate Chauncey. Yeah, there's not going to be a lot of bus ridership through here, I'm sorry. And however, a lot of the buses that are stronger, because there just aren't enough bridges across False Creek, the buses kind of consolidate to either Burrard or Granville, and I don't think Burrard even has wire, so all the trolleys go on Granville. So the 4th Avenue trolleys all divert to downtown, and the trains that not the trains, the buses that stay south of False Creek, the 84, that's a diesel bus. Likewise, the 14 bus, so that's West Broadway, and then instead of continuing on Broadway, it diverts to downtown. That's also going to go on Granville. So important bus street on important buses, the 4 and 14. Yeah. So when they pedestrianized this, they specifically made sure that the trolleys had an alternative route. Again, say more and how. So this is something that you can do. Yeah. All of my tangents are a long tangent, Martha. Yeah, no, Vancouver NIMBYs are, yeah, I mean, it's like how Canadian racists are very open about their racism. American racists say something like, the neighborhood is sketchy. Or they say something about how education, big city districts don't work, something, corruption, something, and something about how most people actually like the police. Like the Americans love arguing from polls, especially when they misquote these polls. The number of people who swear to me that they are actually pro-immigration and then will disinterpret every poll to make Americans look like 2-1 against immigration, not 2-1 for immigration is insane. Okay. Yeah, so you could do this with, this looks like, I could do it with trolleys. I will say that green NIMBYs, so not the NIMBYs in Vancouver. Vancouver NIMBYism, other than Patrick Condon, is right-wing, and even Patrick Condon, the people who are quoting him positively tend to be right-wing NIMBYs, so people who are open their resume. And of course, in Canada, they don't do any of that shit. They don't say people with migration backgrounds are integrating poorly into our country, which is how people in Germany would. Or people in Canada put the same thing as literal racial slurs against Chinese people. No, Canada has casual racism. Or people complaining about natives who they will call natives. To be very clear, in Canada, Indigenous people consider native to be kind of a slur. Native Americans are different. Indigenous Canadians don't like the term native, but anyway, because of, I think, colonial connotations. But anyway, so green NIMBYs, like genuine green NIMBYs. So in the same way that like there are no TERFs in the United States. In the United States, if you hate trans people, it's out of like trad. It's out of some kind of trad concept. In Britain, usually same. Like in Britain, most people who hate trans people vote Tory, voted out, and so on. But Britain does have actual TERFs. So in the same way that there are actual green NIMBYs, Berlin is full of them. These tend to like trams more than trams and trolley buses more than actual buses, and therefore will be more accepting of same on a pedestrianized street than they would of a diesel bus. And this is something that actually one of the NIMBYs that I talked to many years ago when I talked about the M72 through Central Park told me. What they said was, a bus would be terrible because we fought so long to restrict the to remove cars in the last few hours of the day that they were allowed to operate through 72nd through the park. But we would not object to a tram because a tram is so not a car that they would not think, oh, maybe they will bring back cars. But bear in mind, in Vancouver, the trolleys don't go on Granville when it's pedestrianized. They go on parallel streets. But again, the point is that when you pedestrianize something where transit is important, you care about the transit because even these NIMBYs care about transit, and usually pedestrianization is not driven entirely by NIMBYs. It's driven by people who are anti-car, which could be out of a NIMBY ideology, but it could be out of a green ideology that might well be okay with transit-oriented development and just is against cars. And of course, people like that would be very adamant on making sure that there is still transit access, and it's very easy to cut deals because these are people who, again, are very clearly against cars, are very pro-pedestrian, pro-bike in general. So it's very so the proposals for how to provide transit access, and in this case would be parallel streets, would be very compatible with green NIMBY goals when it comes to removing cars from the city. So that's pretty easy. And again, it's not going to ever hurt the night bus network because it always keeps enough access that even if maybe it creates more congestion, that's daytime. Nighttime doesn't matter. Nowadays, in Britain also, Britain does not have as much green NIMBY as I'm like, the Green Party is NIMBY, but the Green Party is kind of a meme in the UK, and I will say that the Green Party here is not a meme, but certainly the National Green Party is not especially NIMBY. It's completely fine signing its name to SPD-led housing growth initiatives, and I think that at this point there already is a churn in favor of like being more pro high-speed rail. Essentially, the Green Party is so city centric, its voter base, that these are the people who, and it's usually very mobile people, nationally mobile, EU mobile. So it's people who benefit very greatly from high-speed trains, because what is a high-speed train? It's a vehicle that gets you fast from Berlin Hauptbahnhof to Leipzig Hauptbahnhof, München Hauptbahnhof, Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, Hamburg Hauptbahnhof. And because this is a population that lives so close to city centers, literally you can see where people mostly vote green and where they mostly vote not green in Berlin, and it's just distance from city center, that there's already, they're not there yet, but they're going there. The Green Party in England is a joke, sure. I thought in, So in Britain, the not explicitly Tory NIMBYism is like the Lib Dems like running on NIMBYism, and where was it in the home county that they just flipped it? That they flipped a seat in a very rich seat in a by-election, and Dom was quoting David Shore instead of figuring out that it was just a NIMBYism. Yes, there is a Green Party in Britain. It mostly serves to just waste votes that should be going Labour. And the thing is, Labour is not at all a NIMBY party. Like Labour, like even very new leftized social democratic parties tend to be very YIMBY. Anne Hidalgo is very unusual, I think, in how she basically governs as a green NIMBY, and not a social democratic YIMBY. But for example, the Social Democrats in Sweden are they're so new left. For example, they're very pro-immigration. They're not at all conflicted. They never needed other people to push them on things like gay rights. The way that in Berlin, for example, not Berlin, in Germany, for example, the self-ID law is being pushed by the Greens and to some extent FDP trying to distinguish itself from CDU. SPD is just following the Greens' lead on this. In Sweden, the Social Democrats are just not like this, to the point that very few people have any reason to vote Green, to the point that the Green Party in Sweden, a lot of their voters are Social Democrats who are just voting for them to keep them just above threshold. Yeah, it's not just high speed too, because Lib Dems are kind of weird. Lib Dems are neither one thing nor another, but something in between, and that does include the joke from Spitting Image from, was it Patty Ashdown? The era when news of his affair with his secretary came out, and his Spitting Image version said, "I did not touch her on one leg or the other." But anyway, no, Lib Dems are just weird. Labor's committed to high speed too, but I mean, everyone's committed to high speed rail. Or rather, to economically strong high speed rail. In Sweden, for example, the Wingers just cancelled high speed rail, but that's because in Sweden, high speed rail is genuinely economically marginal. Sweden is a lightly populated country. I think overall they should build it rather than not build it, but it's not a very easy decision, and a right-wing government that was elected mostly on an agenda of making Greta Thunberg cry more, or doing things that they think will make Greta Thunberg cry more, like nuclear power, which she doesn't really have strong opinions about, would cancel that. Yeah, exactly. They're just a weird part. Like, I think that there was one era in Britain when the Lib Dems genuinely were more left-wing than Labour, and that was the Blair era, especially during the Iraq War, because they were very against the Iraq War, and then that turned into civil liberties stuff like against ID cards. And then they crawled into a Tory government, and especially the part where they ran on abolishing tuition fees, and Cameron did the exact opposite. But anyway, usually, even on stuff that's not just high-speed trains, which are very high prestige and are also profitable and like so strong business case, so the Social Democrats in Sweden, they build housing. Thank you very much. They run on building more housing. SPD here, like the thing that SPD is using to make it to appeal to people under the age of 55 is YIMBYism. Jusos is very aggressively YIMBY, and Jusos, other than on that, are basically the Green Party, including being anti-nuclear. I mean, the Lib Dems could not put the red lines. The problem is that, at least my interpretation is that because Britain doesn't have enough of a tradition of coalitions, the junior partner is completely powerless once they sign an agreement. Now, this is something that's also true to some extent here, where you lose a lot of power after you sign, because if you say they didn't respect our red lines, we're leaving, you look like the bad guy and you lose out in the snap election. And the Lib Dem, it would be especially difficult for the Lib Dems, because the Lib Dems. So at the time, after 2010, there was a left-wing majority, or a center-left majority in the Commons, but it was by like 4 seats, and it required, and I think it was something like Labour plus Lib Dems plus SNP plus Plaid Cymru, and maybe they even needed SDLP from Northern Ireland or something. So because of the difficulty of assembling the progressive options, there was one progressive option, the Lib Dems were rather powerless, and so when the Tories tried to sell them on the rule making it harder to do snap elections, essentially the Lib Dems, they would have looked up, the Tories would have just passed it over their objections, I think. Um, I mean, again, there was such a weak, there was no working progressive majority in 2010. Um, so the Tories could have, so unless Gordon Brown were very good at this, and Nick Clegg were very good at this, and not sure about Brown, but Clegg Law, Cameron would have just ended up doing a minority government with like whichever five most Blairite Labour members were willing to vote or whatever. I mean, obviously not. What's it called? Confidence, but I mean, or even give the Nats their independence referendum, which they got anyway. They just lost the referendum. But anyway, that's very tangent. The point is just you can keep transit on recently pedestrianized things, but probably not legacy pedestrian things like Gulistan. Is the only point I was trying to make about with this rejoinder about NIMBYs and YIMBYs. And so I will say that I think that the Vancouver model of night buses is superior to the New York one, because when the buses run every 20-30 minutes, you do need the time transfers. Now, I will say that New York can't easily adopt the Vancouver model because there isn't one place where the buses would converge. I mean, there is somewhere in Manhattan, but there are so few crossings from Manhattan or the Bronx to Queens and Brooklyn that there would need to be multiple centers, which essentially forces the current system of overnight subways, and that's fine. I mean, New York could just do better maintenance. Other American cities, I think, need to more seriously look at the Vancouver model. And actually, Boston was such a case in 2017. Actually, this is something that I was involved in. I mean, it wiped the party. I wouldn't say it wiped the party for 10 years. And then, yeah, they came back after the European Parliament election in 2019. And then they fucked that up in the subsequent months so much. Which is what happens when you have a party that never thinks of itself as a party in government. Like, if a party of government, they always collapse. Even the Greens here, who are the most party of government Green Party, I want to say in the world, but technically DPP is a Green Party. I mean, the DPP is not a member of the Global Greens. It's a member of, I want to say, centrist Democrats or something. But they literally picked pan green as their color out of an auto like the anti-nuclear green movement. So in a way, DPP is the Green Party government. So the most in government, let's call it Europe, Western Green Party, even they couldn't quite deal with like having a single leader who governed by the party's consensus, but is still a single leader. And as soon as they came third, as soon as they came in third, Robert Habeck got ego essentially and ruined the party. But anyway, in Boston, actually, I want to talk about Boston for a moment, just because Boston is a really good example of how to set up a night bus system de novo. So Boston, for people who don't know, does not even have night buses, and I don't mean it doesn't have a night bus network in the south of Vancouver. It does not have overnight buses. I think it's the only large transit-y U.S. city like that. I think the only other American cities like that are things that don't really have public transit. I think maybe Houston. The line I remember from the Transit Matters campaign is that Boston is one of three in the top 15, and the other two, I want to say there's something like Houston and Atlanta, or again, places that don't meaningfully have public transit. Now, in Boston, they do have timed connections once a day when they shut down the system. So the way it's called East-West. I have no idea why it's called East-West. There's two things that are called East-West in Massachusetts Transit. The first is plans for a regional train between Boston and Springfield, East-West because of the direction. The other is the nighttime shutdown that occurs every night in Boston. So in Boston, like basically everywhere else in the world, the subway shuts down overnight. The way it works is the last train of each day. First of all, so Boston has this kind of square system because through downtown Boston, you can see the red line goes like this. The blue one goes like this, not intersecting red. Hopefully will be fixed eventually with building this thing. It's called the red-blue connector, but this does not yet exist. North-south, and then north-south runs the orange line. Then parallel to it, the green line, which becomes more, which veers west on both sides, here and here. But the green and orange do meet at Haymarket and North Station. So kind of the central transfers look like the sharp key. They look like this. And so the trains stay at wait for a few minutes here so that people can transfer. Then at every station that they go to on the way outbound, the last bus of the day waits for the train, waits for passengers to get off the train, and then goes. There are rules about what gets timed with what. So for example, the more suburban things don't get timed. So the red line has two branches, one more urban to Ashmont, one more suburban to Braintree. The last train of the day, the east-west red line train, is always an Ashmont train. And I actually used it at one point when I was visiting a friend who lives in Dont. The last train of the day, maybe we'll stop at, maybe you get off at Savin Hill, or you get off at Four Corners or so on. Not Four Corners, Fields Corner, sorry. Four Corners is something different. It's a commuter train station. Then the bus waits for the passengers to walk from the platform to the bus, which they're not perfectly co-located. I think the bus is here. No, it's here. So there is a little bit of walking involved, but the bus will wait, and then will the bus leave. So it's a once a day timed transfer. In fact, Transit Matters' first success was when and I say we, but I was not involved. I think I came in just after that. So I think it was Mark Ibunya and Ariosovit who figured out that they were wasting something like $2 million a year on delays, on 20-minute delays on the green lines. On the green line that came from just one branch. It was not very important to the network, the E branch. So essentially they said, okay, prune the E branch from the east-west system and you're saving $2 million. MBTA said, we can't, and then quietly implemented that. So anyway, but these are also last buses of the day. There are no night buses in Boston. So how do you deal with that? So, and this is something that I did get involved in immediately after joining. The idea is to it was to create a night bus network for Boston, and I might even have. No, I would not have it here because it was early 2017, and actually. So I keep thinking my computer is old enough to go to school because it's a computer from 2016, but I only started using it mid-2017. So the crayon that I drew here was on my previous computer, and I didn't bring it over. So the idea would have been to time the connection. So first of all, the idea was hourly initially, not half hourly. In order to bad idea. But the idea was first of all to time the transfer at Copley, and the reason for Copley is that downtown proper is dead after hours. Downtown Boston is a single. It's kind of like the city of London. It's a very single-use office, trad working hours, office work only kind of CBD. So, and the equivalent of the West End is Back Bay. So in the same way that London's overnight tube ignores the city and focuses on the West End, it is correct to time a transfer at Back Bay, somewhere in Back Bay and not downtown Boston. Also, downtown Boston is a pre-car core. Now, again, usually if a place was not ever made car friendly, even if subsequently pedestrianized, there is a reason. Now, the reason here is actually that it was so congested early. It's not that it's not important. It's the London history. It got congested early to the point that they actually built underground transit early, in fact, first time in America, even before New York, by a couple years. It's when they started. There was such congestion on the streetcars that they invented the Stadtbahn by burying the streetcars to form the modern Green Line under Tremont. This was, I think, 1898, and so so this is a CBD, but you probably don't want to string buses through it. In fact, there are no contiguous buses that go through the center of Boston because there are multiple subway lines. The buses in Boston actually feed the subway very well, and and why would you waste service hours on this slog? Where instead, yeah, you can have some buses go from the north to Haymarket, but they don't penetrate farther south. Why would they? Likewise, the silver not line, but lie, because it was supposed to offer equivalent service to the train and very much doesn't. Slogs a bit through downtown Boston, but is not contiguous. It just goes here and turns back. And so you time a transfer here, and then you go in a bunch of directions. And the point is because so remember the rules. There's no traffic, so don't worry. And in particular, don't worry even about serving a street that is kind of congested. I mean, don't do it on like a single laner because you're not going to be able, because it's a system where you do want some kind of reliability, but it's okay to do it on streets that got congested during the daytime. Now, as I mentioned, the bus network in Boston is so oriented around connecting to the subway that you can only peripherally serve a night bus network by looking at the busiest buses. I think the only exception is the 28 because it's in the gap essentially between the red line and the orange line. The Fairmont line not being good enough, and this actually was one of the snags that the MBTA used to nitpick us. Like, we drew a map that didn't try to duplicate existing buses, and the MBTA said, wait, but this needs new bus stops, and that's hard. Like, that level of narrow-mindedness on their part. But it does mean that often it's usually not going to be extensive parts of the network, but sometimes the specific routes you would take by a night bus, the optimal routes, would be routes that don't ever have a daytime bus. So I think what we drew was something about this with 8 routes. So there were 8 routes, one duplicating Green Line, one of the branches of the Green Line, I think the B branch, so just going on Con, not Beacon. One that goes to Cambridge that kind of duplicates the Cambridge part of the Red Line that would go on the Harvard Bridge, up to a little past Harvard. I forget how far, maybe Davis. One duplicating the orange, one duplicating GL, what would later become GLX, and going, I think, Medford. Then one to Malden. I'm forgetting the route. No, maybe there was no duplication here. It was one, and I'm forgetting, it was maybe N57. This would have been N1 because there is actually a daytime bus route. It just does not aim to connect or anything at Back Bay. It just becomes a circumferential on Mass Ave. It's actually a strong bus route. So and I think 57 and 1. I'm forgetting whether this had something. This definitely had something. I want to say this was N110 or something. Like, it's something to Chelsea. Another thing that duplicates the blue line, that was by far the hardest because the bus would have had to... I'm forgetting even the route we said. Maybe through... I'm forgetting whether through the Big Dig or through the old bus road tunnel, with some kind of creative routing on Storrow that specifically avoids the bridges that are too low for buses. Some of the bridges here are too low for buses, others aren't. The bridges here are so low that there's something called being starrowed, where if your car is a little too high because you want an SUV and not a normal person car, your car might actually hit the overpass. That's called being starrowed. So something like this maybe. This is important for the airport. Less for flyers and more for airport workers. So 1, 2, I'm forgetting whether it's 3, 4, 5. One that duplicates the red line to Ashmont. I think we called it N17, but I don't remember. One that duplicates the one that was just the N28 to get to Mattapan, and one to Roxbury. I think went like this. I think we called it N32. Yeah, so that would be without Metro. Because remember it was 8 routes. They were supposed to run on an hourly tact. In retrospect, we should have paid half hourly. And this just did not happen. The generalist failed business leader who was at the time in charge of the MBTA didn't like the idea that it was a paradigm shift of like doing a new kind of service, and instead tried to cobble it into, first of all, governed by pilot, which I did talk about a couple of weeks ago, and second, and then he didn't market it very well, so people didn't know it existed. And third, he didn't like that it was a change to run something overnight. So the thing that actually was sticky, as opposed to the single half-hourly, very zigzaggy route that was retained, was was adding some early morning runs on existing buses. So instead of having a consistent, so the end time in Boston is consistent, but the start time is not. And so instead of doing some kind of clarity of service, what they did do is they added a bunch of early morning buses to the airport, because we talked about various kinds of trips that could be served, and this was the easiest to measure. So they essentially centered this. Wait, what are you guys talking about in chat? Yeah, so yeah, I'm guessing in Berlin it's because the buses, the night buses, try very hard to duplicate the U-Bahn as much as possible. Okay, but people generally hate walking through certain places. Bear in mind that so important things about this area. This is a wealthy area. It didn't even get to the point that there were NIMBYs. There were people who said that there might be NIMBYs, but there was no public NIMBYism, and Transit Matters has enough insiders that if there were some kind of behind-the-scenes NIMBYism, I think I would have heard, and I didn't hear of any of that. It was just Luis Ramirez being a potted plant. Might have actually been my first introduction to just the uniquely bad state of American transit management. But anyway, so the point is that in Boston, what we proposed would have been a Vancouver-style system. In fact, I looked. The reason I can tell you so much about Vancouver is not because I rode the night buses. In fact, I didn't, because all of the social events that I would go to that would stretch past were so out of the way that the night buses didn't even reach that far. And so instead I was trying to time myself to get to the last train of the day, and not to some kind of night bus. But so actually what I know about the Vancouver night bus system is not from ever having used it, but from having used the daytime network enough to understand the context, and then looked a lot at it while working with Transit Matters on the Boston proposal. And and remember also, Boston is a little bit like London in having a lot of old streets, but in Boston it's a much smaller core like this, and outside this kind of small core, most streets are trash, but enough streets are not that you can that it's fine for the system, and especially because Boston has enough rail lines, the buses can just pretty efficiently connect to train stations. Boston does not actually have a bad street network for buses. Yeah. So about why would you ever expect a menu? Yeah. Yeah. So that's the problem. Like many. So the thing is, remember, I don't actually know the economics of this in Czechia, but in the United States, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the operating cost of a bus come from the wage of the driver. Um, so literally, it doesn't matter how big the bus is; the operating cost is almost certainly going to be the same. Um, Now, maintenance is going to depend on size, but I think aggressively. Fuel is going to be probably pretty proportional, but fuel in the United States is like 3% of the cost of bus operating cost. Acquisition cost is significant. So this means that because American bus acquisition costs are very high, much higher than here. But what does this mean? It means that if you want more articulated buses for better peak service, then you need to pay more to acquire them. Now, of course, you would still do that because that means you're paying fewer drivers, but that is for the peak. If you need to buy a separate kind of bus just for the use of night operations, that's spending more money. You're not actually saving money. To the contrary. Um, Now, yeah. Now, in Vancouver specifically, there are many buses that are called community shuttles that are used on connecting routes, um, generally for very poor riders because people who are not very because connecting routes. I don't mean the core grid. I mean people who live on like on like Indian reservations or like in very low density suburbia and have some kind of bus that connects them from I don't know here or something like that to SkyTrain or to a or to a more serious bus. Like the point is if you're living somewhere around here and you're on a bus, it's because you can't afford a car. So again, very low income riders, even as middle class people within the city and closer in suburbs like Richmond and Burnaby rely on buses and trains all the time. And what they do, so for example, it means that they abuse the poor riders with worse frequencies and so on. But one of the things that they do is they pay the drivers less. It's kind of a union agreement. It's a lower pay position to drive a community shuttle than to drive a mainline bus. I think to some extent it might even be viable in general, just because when the vehicle is smaller, it hits the so there's a thing where with large vehicles the um, impact of poor road quality is worse, and it's especially worse at the ends of the bus, front and back. So if you ride back and you're over the age of, let's say, 18 or perhaps 12, you will feel the pain whenever the bus hits something. Um, and so, no, the driver sits at the very front and gets all of the road bumps transmitted right up their spine, leading to very poor health outcomes for bus drivers. It's a lot like truck drivers. And this is something, so the upshot is that the market wage of driving a bus is actually higher than the market wage of driving, let's say, a cab, just because the cab is a car. And the minivan is going to be in the middle. So again, you can get away with that to some extent, but you're not actually saving money relative to capacity. Unless it's a bus that has so few riders, yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of Vancouver was generally I don't know in what era. I imagine late 19th century, early 20th, was pretty conscientious about making sure to kick out indigenous people from all valuable land. But in area, but due to urban growth, some suburbs reach as far as the res. And in one case, somewhere on the west side, I'm forgetting where, I think somewhere around here, they goofed and did not ethnically cleanse the Indians as much as they would have preferred to, and as a result, there's a res that's close enough to that's not even close enough, that's like within the urban core, and now because indigenous people in Canada are not psychopaths, they're pretty yimby. and they're building high density, partly social housing here, and there's nothing that the West Side NIMBYs can do about it, and the West Side NIMBYs are pissed, and this is delightful. They should keep neglecting to do ethnic cleansing in more places in the future. So this is not a community shuttle place at all. This is a walk to a frequent bus or walk to SkyTrain place. But the more peripheral places would be. Yep. Why would buses anything but low floor? Because the traditional buses are high floor, and the United States took forever to get to low floor buses, and yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, the fact that the kits, I shouldn't say kits is mad. I would say the kits NIMBYs are mad. Remember, kits is also where all the postdocs and grad students at UBC live. It's either that or I've never heard anyone use this term Fairview to call this. It's called Central Broadway. It's kits or Central Broadway. It's just that the gown doesn't get a vote. E.g., the gown is very often not even Canadian citizens. So yeah, the people in kits who are Canadian citizens have lived in the neighborhood 15 or more years and don't have an affiliation with the university, are mad. Fuck them. All of their income rests on the fact that people in all of their landlord income or homeowner appreciation rests on like value created by a middle class that would live in all of the market rate units that are being created. They can get stuffed. But anyway, so the point is that usually you would not minibus it, and the reason you would not minibus is it's easier to do maintenance, but first of all, maintenance costs, they are real, but they're a secondary factor. Second, it's mostly an American thing. That just American maintenance is used to American high floor buses. I don't think maintenance costs here are higher than the United States with a low floor fleet. So you would definitely never get a separate fleet for night buses. Why would you? The whole point is to reuse assets you have. And yeah, the maintenance. So much of the maintenance is on the engine anyway. That's why trolleys are cheaper to maintain. But anyway, so so what you do is you do have a night bus network. You should be aware that it will not have full reach. That's fine. The night bus is a night version of the more popular routes, not of coverage routes. You cannot afford coverage routes. Coverage routes are already kind of a money dump during the daytime, even when you can do things like community shuttles, like the Vancouver minibuses. At night, just forget about it. That's fine. And again, this is why I didn't use them when I go to play board games with people who live in fucking Langley. Even though Langley is a lot more urban than, let's say, Delta, to the point that there are plans to extend SkyTrain here, that was still bus, SkyTrain, bus, and still quite a walk, and still a bit of a walk. So the night bus. So don't think about night buses here, unless again, if this maybe nowadays you should start thinking of a night bus going all the way to Langley, but this is after 10 more years of growth. Again, be comfortable with that. I mean, it's a night network. It's not going to be as strong as a daytime network, and this means you're also losing out on coverage, and that's okay. Oh yeah, I guess so. So the point is, that's probably the best way to run a night bus network. I don't actually know what you do when you have so much potential ridership that you're running them every 10 or 15 minutes. I guess the Berlin solution might be the best because again, remember in Berlin, they don't do either the New York style, just run some of the buses overnight at reduced frequency system, or nor is there a central timed connection point. it's something that especially would work poorly for the Berlin urban geography, where Berlin has it has atypically low kurtosis, in that, so kurtosis, as a reminder, is the fourth moment, which is essentially whether the standard deviation is about near center or far from center things. So, okay, this is the best way to portray it. As the colors go to the south here, not the colors, the lines go to the south here, just the colors, the kurtosis falls. So, I hate zoomable SVGs. So this is low kurtosis. So the standard deviation here is generated by a bunch of mass, one standard deviation from the mean. The red is high kurtosis. There isn't as much stuff 1.5 standard deviation from the mean, but then there's much more stuff 2 or 3. I mean, less than 1.5, but more than in the low kurtosis case. So, so I believe all of these distributions have the same standard deviation. And of course, they're both symmetric at 0. They're all symmetric at 0, so all the same mean and 0 skewness. Berlin is atypical in how much like this or like this it is, in that it is monocentric, but it is monocentric around a center that stretches all the way from the Zoo to Warschauer Straße. So yeah, it's monocentric where this is the center. Huge center. And then a place like, so for example, Stockholm and Munich are both called monocentric in a way that Berlin isn't, because Berlin is monocentric, but has so many internal centers that it's kind of not nice to call it that. And then Stockholm is monocentric, where the center is, the center stretches from Slussen to maybe 2 subway stops north of T-Centralen. So this is the center of Stockholm, which is much smaller. And the rest of central Stockholm is residential. It's like the village. Like this is the village, or again left and right of Paris. And this is like Upper West End, Upper East End, for New York, for people with New York references. So, or Munich, same things, centered around a rather small city center. It's just in Berlin, there are not really strong secondary centers at all. Now this is great for transit, but for night transit, if you want everything to converge in one central point, that one central point needs to be actually central. Vancouver has that. So American cities tend to have, be higher kurtosis than European cities. That is to say, more skyscrapers downtown. Of course, Vancouver is very skyscraper-y for how small it is. But then you compare the land use in Vancouver 5 kilometers out, in Berlin 5 kilometers out. Chauncey, like this is Chauncey. Chauncey is by a straight line 4 kilometers. I lived in a pretty dense area, 3 point something kilometers. But you're getting into places that are not even like especially snobbish. Like there's things like this. That's not especially dense. It's like missing middle density. Within 5 kilometers. But again, skyscrapers, including residential, but also commercial, that just doesn't exist in Berlin. Like there are 5 of them. So because Vancouver has high kurtosis, it's very easy to meet at one central point, and make it here. Boston has higher kurtosis than a European city, but lower than, let's say, Chicago or Vancouver. Chicago is probably the purest example of high kurtosis. Very high rise in the loop, but the job density and also the height of the buildings, which are essentially the same thing. Craters outside the loop, like 5 kilometers from the loop, you're here, and this is. I think there are empty lots on the south side, or if there aren't, it's very recent info. Like all these are not high density neighborhoods at all. Like this is the land use 5 kilometers from the center of the loop. Yeah, some of these buildings are multi-story apartment buildings, but I think some of these might actually be row houses, or maybe townhouses with like 4 apartments, 2 floors. And so Boston is lower kurtosis than this because Boston does have strong subcenters. Boston is, I think, the third most city center centric American city behind New York and South. Eurovision lol, huh? Yeah, that's always a thing. Like, I mean, you just look at maintenance costs and see what happens. Um, yeah, but anyway, so in Boston, the point is that there are strong subcenters. Back Bay, Tech Square. At this point, the Kendall Square, just been called Tech Square. Tech Square is the name of the development. So Kendall, Back Bay, Longwood. Honestly, Charles and GH, but that might just be just that's literally adjacent to downtown, so maybe I wouldn't count it separately. They're starting to build one around the Seaport District with the convention center. Uh, so, so in Boston, it might be a little bit harder, but again, there's a gimme, which is that the main downtown shuts down at 5 in the afternoon to the point that I literally cannot get edible fast food past about 6 or 7 there. Like I need to go to like literally just munch on chocolate at the train station because the alternative is McDonald's or Qdoba or something. And this is not big enough yet. People here never go outside Camberville, so you can make this your center, and that's fine. No, in Berlin, that's no way. Again, in Berlin, there's no way this could ever work, and that's fine. Berlin is enough of a transit city that you can actually start doing on-time transfers on the NightBus network. New York is too big for this. San Francisco is too big for this. So I would say I would just say figure it out. But in New York, there is a way to figure it out. You just run the subway overnight, and then you figure out what to do with a stronger bus network, with stronger buses. I'm imagining you. So for the record, when I did the Brooklyn bus redesign, I implicitly assumed all buses run the usual service every either 20 or 30 minutes overnight. I believe the formula I drew was for 30, but the difference in operating costs between 30 and 20 is a rounding error, and at any rate, I was assuming that the cost of a service kilometer is based on daytime average speeds. So in practice, I was already assuming a bus runs every 20 minutes just because the average speed at night is that much higher than in the daytime. And yeah, so this is kind of like what you want to do for night transit. Again, run the trains if you can, but usually you can't, and usually you also don't need to. Usually have streets, use them. Again, New York uniquely has very wide rivers. San Francisco actually has the same thing with the connection to Oakland. I don't actually know to what extent it's viable to tell people to keep using buses on the bridge. BART does not run overnight. I imagine it's possible for BART to run overnight, single track through the Transbay tube. But maybe that's too long of a section. I honestly don't know. Okay. Questions. Okay. Yeah. I should start taking questions. Good. This is a really good question. Should night service have the same stop spacing as daytime service? I'm going to throw something out there and say that certainly in a North American context, night bus service should not have stops. Night bus service should run the basis of you ask the driver where to get off, because the American context, Yeah, of course you should do all stop and not ever have rapids, but I also don't think that there should ever be rapid buses. Like if you have enough, if your corridor has so much frequency that you're actually gaining something from running multiple service patterns on the same route, you need a subway, not light rail, subway. Uh, and Now the thing is, bus stops cost time to serve, about 30 seconds to a bus stop, but only if anyone uses them, because the whole point is that a bus stop with 0 users, the bus will just careen past it and not stop. And so if there aren't a lot of riders on a bus, you do not need to worry very much about bus stop locations. The New York system is the bus driver will stop wherever you ask them to. As long as the driver thinks that it is safe to stop there. New York in the 2020s being New York in the 2020s and not Caracas in the 2010s and 20s or Bogota in the 2000s. There is not actual transportation risk, and therefore the answer is it is always safe. Would a night bus driver want to talk to the passengers? Why not? In fact, something that Martha told me a couple years ago when I was interviewing her to talk about driverless buses is something that she mentioned to me. And again, I don't mind sharing a conversation because it was explicitly not a private conversation. It was a conversation that I quoted in that I quoted on like in the prospect. Malta song. Oh right, today's not even the finals. Yeah, what metric I'm using for the centrality of the city? Proportion of jobs that are in a either specified distance from a city center point or within a blob that can be gerrymandered. So when I say blob that can be gerrymandered, in San Francisco, the percentage will look bad if you try to draw a point around Embarcadero and say how many people work, what percentage of people work within 5 kilometers of Embarcadero, because because something like half of the circle, the only people who live here are people who pissed off the mob. And I don't think San Francisco even has much of an active mafia. So people who pissed off the mob 100 years ago live here. So by gerrymandering blobs, I mean I'm allowed to do things like draw things like around specific tourist zones, and like maybe draw a blob that will like even get to UCSF. Like I don't think this goes to UCSF. This maybe goes to UCSF. Like this, I mean, like not like things that don't look terrible, but like this or something. And then I can also add downtown Oakland, which is not perfectly contiguous with San Francisco, but there's water in between, and literally the only way to get between here and here by road or rail is effectively contiguous because of the way the exits on the freeway works. Not the exits on the freeway works, the exits on the freeway work. So this is what I mean by I'm allowed to gerrymander. So this is to some extent a judgment call. In Paris, for example, I did city proper plus Neuilly plus the communes that include La Défense. I like doing 100 square kilometers, and this is because it is the land area of what I just mentioned to you in Paris. It is also the land area in Vancouver, and I don't have data in Paris, and only have very low, and in theory, but not in practice, and only in theory, but not in practice, have the data in Vancouver below the level of the municipality. In Paris, it's also arrondissement. So a lot of it is data availability. This is why I use the 100 square kilometers. It's like that based on data availability, which is very imperfect. There's much better data out there about population and job density. And then you realize that it's degressive to the point that if you try to draw a 100 square kilometer blob around Austin, Texas, you get to something like 35%, which is the same as New York, Boston, San Francisco, or maybe Paris. It's just that within 100, there's no way to do a 100 square kilometer blob that's all recognizably urban around Austin. Try 10. Whereas in New York, the 100 square kilometer blob will not even get to downtown Newark. In DC, it will get to, I think, the Pentagon and and downtown Arlington, but it will not get. I don't think it will get to any of the other TOD zones. Like, I don't think you can make a reasonable 100 square kilometer blob in DC that gets to Bethesda and Silver Spring. So that's how I measure. I don't think it would resemble anything Tokyo has. Tokyo is incredibly radial. Chinese metro systems are suburban metros, so closer, but other than Beijing, they're all incredibly radial. To the point that Matt Iglesias, who suffers from alism, recognizes the radial metro network in Chinese cities after I blogged about it a bunch. Yeah. So anyway, about the stop spacing, just whenever people get off or whenever the bus driver sees someone single. So anyway, I was sort of saying that I was interviewing Martha, right? And what Martha told me is that I forget whether Martha, I'm forgetting whether you mentioned this to me about London, but you mentioned to me about Baltimore that the night buses don't have a lot of passengers, so you deliberately try to sit next to the driver for safety in numbers. Maybe you mentioned this to me also about London. I don't remember. I know that in New York, I was interviewing someone for the same article, someone who lives in the Bronx, and what she told me is that she never feels unsafe on a bus, but she also said that that in the Bronx, even at night, the buses have like 20 passengers, so there's safety numbers on the entire bus. So again, I don't think it's a big deal for the bus driver to have a get off wherever the fuck you want system, and usually the riders are sufficiently not antisocial that they're not going to, that if I need to get off at 54th Street or something and I see the bus stop at 53rd, I'm not going to be the asshole who makes the bus driver stop again at 54th. I'm probably just going to hop off at 53rd. Chinese systems don't look like spaghetti. They're actually they're very rigidly radial, except for Beijing and to some extent, and I think also Shenzhen and maybe Guangzhou. Shanghai is like radial Tokyo style, so like a big blob in the middle that isn't, because these are giant cities. So I talk about kurtosis before. Tokyo is not a city of, I mean, I guess you can measure the kurtosis in Tokyo, but I don't think of the difference between Tokyo and New York, so I think of the difference between New York and Paris as one of kurtosis. New York has higher kurtosis, much higher job density in the central 5 square kilometers because there are skyscrapers in New York and not in Paris. Midtown Manhattan has 800,000 jobs in 4 square kilometers. Nowhere in Paris do you have that, but the job density in New York drops off faster than in Paris. So in Paris, at the scale of 100 square kilometers, the job density is lower, but that's because it's a smaller city. But the share of jobs that are in that is higher than in New York. In Tokyo, the share is maybe a little bit less than in New York or Paris. It's a higher absolute count of jobs. There's a bigger aggressivity there. But also in Tokyo, I only have the numbers at the level of the ward, so all I can do is take the job densest wards and do that. So I can't do some kind of gerrymander that doesn't include the Imperial Palace, for example, which occupies a lot of very valuable land in Tokyo. So I can't do some kind of weird gerrymander that like does, I don't know, this part of central Tokyo, and then I just pick out the actual commercial part of Shinagawa, or the actual commercial part, like Shibuya, the neighborhood, not the ward, Shinjuku, the neighborhood, not the ward, not all of Toshima, just Ikebukuro. Like, I can't do that. So, but I'm assuming Tokyo is probably comparable in percentage. So I would not consider Tokyo the difference anyway between Tokyo and either New York or Paris to be one of kurtosis. It's rather one of standard deviation. Tokyo is just a more centralized city than both of them. So Tokyo maybe doesn't have the job density of New York, but probably is close. Like Tokyo does have commercial skyscraper. So maybe central 5 or 10 square kilometer job density is the same as New York, and then central 100 kilometers is relative to population almost Paris, so in absolute number much more than Paris, and then the density stays high, whereas Paris at this distance from city center is well into suburbia. Tokyo is just, again, bigger and denser, so lower standard deviation. Just as a reminder, the physical extent of Metro Tokyo is less than that of Metro New York. Because there's less sprawl. Like 10 kilometers out of Tokyo, you're in Nakano. Like this is the land use in Nakano. I mean, yeah, some of the buildings are small, but first of all, there's a hierarchy. Lower density at a randomly selected place, higher density when you're near the train station, and even at the lower density, even in the lower density part, like this is denser than Chicago or Vancouver 5 kilometers out, and this is not 5 but 10. And remember that in Vancouver, in Chicago, the density is more uniform at like in a specific neighborhood. I mean, in Vancouver, when you have non-uniformity, it's near a train station, so it would be very recent DOD, and that's not the West End. And then New York, I don't know, 10 kilometers from Times Square. Like, the density is not terrible, like 10 kilometers from Times Square. Like, I mean, Corona, Corona is not nothing, but it is lower here. It's not flat. There's higher density in Queens Boulevard, but it's not as organized. And this is one direction, and then you do it in the opposite direction, and you get to Secaucus. There's a reason people make fun of Jersey. Land use within what, if there were appropriate bike infrastructure, would be biking distance of Midtown Manhattan. Anyway, are there more questions about the night bus issue or related things? I shouldn't talk as much about kurtosis. Also, it's May, not late June, so sorry for the darkness. What's the lag? Oh, there's very little lag. It's only 7 seconds. Like a skin condition? No, it's not a skin condition. My skin is fine. No, the condition is that it is broad daylight at 7 in the evening, and it is not daylight at 9:30 in the evening, and therefore I don't think about turning on the light when I start streaming when it is May. I do turn on the light when it's, the 6 months of the year when when the sun sets before 7 in the evening. But now 3 weeks from now, it's fine because Berlin sunsets go up until about 10 something. Oh, kurtosis, not kartosis, kurtosis. This is how it's spelled. Again, fourth moment. Third moment being skewness, which is kind of whether you have more mass to the left of the mean or to the right of the mean. But it doesn't quite say whether the median is less or more than the mean, because the kind of expected direction is, like, there's an expected direction which you would, based on skewness, but there are counterexamples in both directions. Probability is fun. And by fun, I mean there are 2 math courses in college where I did not get an A plus beyond the first year courses, beyond the freshman courses. One was probability and the other was linear programming. I got a B plus in linear programming and an A minus in probability. But probability is fun. And frozen for some reason. We'll let this unfreeze and then do a last round of questions and then adjourn. Usually my streams are supposed to be an hour and a half to 2 hours when there's no crayon, and there's no crayon here. I guess I did a little bit of crayoning for the Boston night buses. I have no idea why my face is frozen here. Let's see what happens if I refresh. I can't actually tell if you guys can see this. And if not, then we can just close this stream. Like, it's a good point to end. I just want to do a last... Oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. It's not even that laggy. Okay. So anyway, are there questions? And if not, we can end this. So anyway, thank you all for watching. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for sticking by. Especially thanks to everyone who is not watching Eurovision. Because Eurovision stretches to Saturday, any Saturday, it's likely but not guaranteed I will do a Saturday stream. It will also cover a predominantly non-European topic for the same reason. And then in a week, I'm definitely streaming, and I'm streaming about European cross-border high-speed rail issues, just because this is by far the biggest topic on Transit Mastodon, just because essentially Mastodon is a very pan-European crowd. So anyway, thank you all, and I will see you again maybe on Saturday. I might talk about LA, or in a week talking about high-speed rail in Euroland, and yeah, that will include Crayon. So thank you, and ciao.